Out of all the games I've reviewed thus far, Mass Effect was the one I found the hardest to write a script for. Normally, when I set about reviewing a game, I have an idea of how I want to start off the video. It could be a major story theme, the gameplay, its impact on the industry, its early development, its dominance within a certain genre, etc. However, with Mass Effect, the first game of the initial trilogy, I really don't know where to begin. Do I focus on the storytelling foresight of Casey Hudson, Drew Karpyshyn, and BioWare in crafting what would be 1/3 of arguably the biggest overarching narrative continuity in gaming history? Do I discuss the lore and alternate futuristic history crafted between humanity and dozens of conceived alien races? What about the legitimately impactful choice making and the Paragon Renegade morality systems? Or the meshing of traditional role-playing elements with white-knuckle third-person combat? The point I'm driving at here is that there are so many different facets that make up Mass Effect that it's almost daunting to attempt to cover them all, much less tie them all together in one review. When I did my first retrospective review on BioShock, I discussed how all of its various elements melded seamlessly together into one cohesive whole, which is greater than the sum of its parts. However, Mass Effect is more of a smorgasbord of different gameplay and narrative elements. It's almost like the video game equivalent of a variety act, falling under the giant umbrella of what is quite literally an alternate universe. So, with that said, why don't we just start from the very beginning? The development for Mass Effect began in 2004 by developer BioWare and director Casey Hudson. Hudson and BioWare had previously worked on 2003's Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic, a turn-based role-playing game based within the Star Wars universe. The game received critical acclaim and became something of a cult classic on the original Xbox and PC. Development for their next project began in 2004, with the emerging next-gen Xbox console in mind. Although Mass Effect would go on to be something of a spiritual successor to Knights of the Old Republic, much like BioShock was a spiritual successor to System Shock, check out my first video review for more on that. Hudson and BioWare wanted it to be bigger and more evolved than that game in every conceivable way. For one, Hudson wanted to move away from the turn-based combat in favour of third-person shooting. He wanted more narrative depth and scope, which is why the first Mass Effect was conceived as the first in a trilogy of games from the very beginning. He also wanted the protagonist to have more personality and be able to make moral or immoral choices, which would not only affect his or her personality and the perception of others, but that would actually have a significant and major impact on the story itself. The game was officially announced at the XO5 Game Show in Amsterdam on October 4th, 2005. It was presented yet again with a short demo at the following year's Electronic Entertainment Expo, where it won various awards. At the 2007 E3 show, it made yet another appearance with an even longer playable demo. It again was highly acclaimed at the expo, and was one of the most anticipated releases that year. When players finally got their hands on the finished product, most of them would be relieved to discover that the anticipation was more than warranted. The game starts out with a very brief explanation of who protagonist Commander Shepard is, as well as a written introduction explaining the mass relays. Simply put, Shepard was an orphan raised on the streets of Earth who joined the Alliance military at a young age, and who would, through his skill and grit, go on to achieve the rank of commander. However, not long before the events of the game, his entire unit was wiped out when they were attacked on the planet of Akuz, which left him scarred and could be used to explain some potential acts later in the game, more on which later. In the year 2148, explorers on Mars found an ancient artifact which contained a technology which had the ability to control space and time. This gave humans the ability to engage in unprecedented levels of intergalactic exploration and discovery. The technology was called Mass Effect, the relays of which allows spacecrafts to travel to the farther reaches of the Milky Way. This also resulted with them making contact with various other intelligent alien civilizations. Untrusted and unproven as a relatively new and primitive species, humans have since tried to prove themselves to the other races and the Citadel Council, a kind of governing body made up of a multi-alien coalition which rules so-called Citadel space. The brevity of this introduction, which for the record doesn't even contain half the information I just shared, is deceptive because the rest of the game is extraordinarily ambitious in scope. When I say scope, I mean that as an umbrella term for almost every facet of gameplay and presentation imaginable. Everything from the story, to the combat, to the dialogue, to the graphical presentation is highly complex and jam-packed, the results of which are mostly brilliant, if occasionally disjointed. This can be seen in the gameplay during the first mission in the game. While flying through the solar system on the Normandy, the Alliance ship that Shepard will go on to be the captain of, Shepard is informed that he is to go on a mission to Eden Prime to locate a beacon, an ancient piece of Prothean technology. Protheans were an ancient alien race that vanished over 50,000 years ago, but whom had developed extraordinary technology while they existed. The second purpose of the mission is an evaluation of Shepard by Nihilus, a Turian Spectre who happens to be on board the Normandy. A Turian is one of dozens of different alien races present in the game. Although having almost reptilian-like faces, Turians are among the most intelligent races in the galaxy. They are also one of the most human-like races in the game due to their similar skeletal frame, articulate speech, and wit. A Spectre is an agent appointed by the Citadel Council. They are very select and elite soldiers who are afforded an incredible amount of authority by the Council within Citadel space. They wield an incredible amount of power, including the authority to kill people if they deem it necessary, at least within reason. Captain Anderson, the captain of the Normandy and a close ally of Shepard, is campaigning for Shepard to become the first ever human Spectre, and is looking for Nihilus' endorsement. The Normandy also receives a distress signal that comes through in the form of a video, which shows a human Alliance soldier under attack on Eden Prime. Shepard and his team immediately fly, via mass relay, to the system to investigate the status of the crew, but with the location of the Prothean beacon being of top priority. Upon landing, and with Nihilus scouting ahead, Shepard and Kaidan Alenko, an Alliance Marine and Biotic, make their way through the landscape in search of any surviving Alliance soldiers. Kaidan serves on the Normandy alongside Shepard and is the first member of his squadron. He is also, as mentioned, a Biotic. Biotics have, by utilising Mass Effect technology, the ability to levitate, freeze, and send enemies flying with gravitational force. It basically means that Biotics possess telekinetic powers, which are contextualized in the game through the advances in technology, which feels normal within the Mass Effect universe. The first enemies you come across are flying drones who kill Jenkins, the other squad member with you, who bears no explanation because, well, he immediately dies. After shooting these from the sky, you move on and come across Ashley Williams, a gunnery sergeant that is being shot at by Geth troopers. The Geth are an artificial intelligence who were created by the Quarians, a super intelligent yet solitary humanoid race, who created them for labour. After becoming sentient, a war between the Geth and the Quarians ensued, which led to the few surviving Quarians being driven from their home planet of Rannoch to the outer reaches of the Milky Way. The Geth play a major role in the Mass Effect story, but not these troopers as they've been switched off by a hail of bullets. Talking with Ashley, she informs you that the rest of her squad was wiped out. You can respond in three ways. You can be sympathetic and nurturing, you can be callous and critical, or you can react neutrally. This, along with an optional reaction to Jenkins, is your first true interaction with the morality system that exists throughout the game, which fills either a paragon meter or a renegade meter depending on how you treat and communicate with people. The next thing that you come across are the dead bodies of Alliance soldiers suspended by giant spikes. Suddenly, the spikes lower, and the soldiers are revived as hideous creatures known as husks. The Geth use the bodies of dead humans and reanimate them to attack their enemies. Upon killing these enemies, presumably in a panic, you come across two scientists hiding in a trailer. Talking to them, they give you information on the location of the Prothean beacon. While there, Shepard can hack storage lockers for weapons, armour, and upgrades. All of this introduces many of the key gameplay elements of Mass Effect. The first is the morality system, which we've already discussed, that can be utilised to charm or intimidate the scientists. The second is the combat. Mass Effect is a third-person shooter which combines the classic 1-2 of guns and grenades with special abilities.
The guns use advanced technology, which allows them to fire using energy rather than dispensable ammunition, meaning that technically all weapons have unlimited ammunition. The game balances this out by making every gun overheat after too much repetitive fire, meaning you cannot just continuously shoot at an enemy. You have 4 different weapon types: assault, shotgun, sniper, and pistol. As mentioned, Kaidan has biotic abilities that can come in handy to incapacitate enemies and keep them at bay, as well as dealing out damage. After one use, each biotic power must recharge, which can take tens of seconds. He also has the ability to hack lockers and encrypted objects. The second thing is squad management. We've already established that Mass Effect is a third-person shooter where combat is concerned, but the game is also an RPG, and we can see this when it comes to leveling up our squad. This can be done in 2 ways. The first is in weapon allocation. Exploring the worlds thoroughly and unlocking lockers and opening crates will provide new weaponry. You can also simply go to stores to buy weaponry, but this naturally costs money. Every squad member can carry the 4 aforementioned weapons. However, not all squad members are proficient with them all. In fact, I believe Ashley and Shepard are the only 2 members skilled with all 4. Therefore, you can give your members guns which complement their skill set. You can also provide your biotic squad mates with biotic amps to enhance their abilities, and Omni tools to enhance the hacking abilities of those within your squad who are engineers. All the squad mates wear armour too, so you can assign them armour based on their race and skill set. On top of this, you can also customise all your weaponry, armour and tools. This is actually a pretty deep system, as all of these items can have multiple upgrades. For example, as you progress through the game, you can have an assault rifle with up to 4 upgrade slots, which include everything from incendiary bullets, to combat radars, to heat reducers, to advanced scopes. Considering you have to, or at least should, do this for all equipment for all squad members, this is an extremely thorough process, which is either incredibly immersive or overwhelming, depending on what kind of player you are. The second way to upgrade your squad is through experience points. These increase your squad members' fundamental abilities, making them more powerful and durable in combat, and more proficient at their individual skills. For example, when gathering experience, Ashley can upgrade her assault rifle skill, which will make her more accurate, more deadly, and less likely to overheat while firing that weapon. Kaidan can also evolve his biotic abilities, which will lower the recharge time, make them more powerful, and all while unlocking additional abilities. Some of the characters also have unique attributes which can be enhanced. Shepard can increase his ability to charm people or intimidate people during conversation, depending on whether he's virtuous or devious, which can affect everything from getting discounts at stores to saving the lives of key characters during tense standoffs. If this all sounds like a lot, it's because it is. The gameplay mechanics in Mass Effect are incredibly extensive. This isn't even necessarily due to the depth of individual components, but due to the sheer amount of components simultaneously at play. Some have criticised the combat in the game, saying that the weaponry lacks any real weight and that the controls are cumbersome. The former is up for debate, but the latter is pretty indisputable. The control scheme for the combat, particularly weaponry, can feel a little awkward, especially when it comes to firing grenades, which are mapped to the select button on the PS3. However, the reason for this is down to the fact that fitting everything from the weapons to the special abilities to the squad commands on one controller must have been extremely challenging. When it came to mapping the controller for the game, sacrifices had to be made to squeeze everything in. The other criticism is squad commands. During combat, you can command your squad to stay, follow you, or move to specific locations, autonomous of your own movements. You do this by using the D-pad, and while this isn't necessarily the end of the world, it's your squad's responsiveness that is the problem. Often they go to certain spots without taking cover, and will often act nonsensically in combat in general, often resulting in them dying needlessly. You can revive them using the Unity ability, but it can become tiresome after a while. All these criticisms are valid. However, I will say in defense of the game that because it tries to do so much, it was never going to execute everything perfectly. This may seem like a lazy argument, but it's more of a feel thing. Many games, including ones I've covered, are greater than the sum of their parts, and Mass Effect is a prime example of this. However, while many titles absorb all their elements into one cohesive experience, Mass Effect is more of a variety show in the gameplay department. This is part of its charm and its immersion. There's just something unique and cool about having so many gameplay elements at your disposal. Third-person gunplay, supernatural abilities, squad management, RPG leveling up, deep customization features, that its weaknesses just become of lesser and lesser consequence as you make your way through the game and its story. Very few games offer you this level of variety, and very few games distract you with a story and the lore, the depth of Mass Effect. Aside from this, none of the aforementioned mechanics are actually that bad. Everything fundamentally works, and a few awkward button maps and bugs, more on them later aside, it's actually quite enjoyable once you get the hang of it. Later on, we see a cutscene where Nihilus comes in contact with Saren, another Turian Spectre. After a brief back and forth, Saren pulls his gun out on Nihilus and shoots him when his back is turned. After finding his body, a dock worker who was hiding during the altercation informs Shepard that a Turian named Saren shot him. Meanwhile, the same Turian has instructed the Geth to plant bombs to blow the whole place up. He then approaches the Prothean beacon, which attracts him through a force field, levitating him as the scene ends. As you make your way through the level, picking off Geth and disabling the bombs, you will eventually come across the Prothean beacon. When one of your squad mates walks towards it and begins getting sucked into its magnetic field, Shepard runs and pushes them out of the way, which results in him being sucked into it. Levitating in the air as Saren had, you begin to have a vision. Although it is almost indecipherable, it appears, at least as far as Shepard is concerned, to show the mass slaughter of organic life by synthetic beings. Saren is informed by an unknown Asari, a race I will explain in greater detail later, that the colony of Eden Prime was saved and that a human had used the beacon. This infuriates our now obvious antagonist, who vows to eliminate Shepard. After waking up on the Normandy and informing Anderson and his crew of the vision and Nihilus' assassination, they must travel to the Citadel to both inform the Council of Saren's actions and to push for Shepard's promotion as a Spectre. In a meeting with the Council and Saren via hologram, Shepard informs them that Saren has gone rogue, while also detailing his vision to the Council. Saren, naturally, denies all of this while ridiculing Shepard and calling his vision a dream, while the Council, who respect Saren's rank and are wary of the lack of evidence, are reluctant to believe Shepard. In light of this, Shepard sets out to find people on the Citadel who may have information on Saren and who can help stop him. This sets in motion the other key elements of Mass Effect, namely plot development, squad building, quest completion, side missions, and the importance of dialogue choices. In fact, the only facet of Mass Effect which will have yet to be introduced after leaving the Citadel for the first time is planetary and solar exploration. The Citadel is the most impressive location in the entire game. First of all, it's huge. So big in fact that there are transportation stations which you can use to hop from one location to the other without having to physically walk. Secondly, it's aesthetically pleasing. Its dichotomy of sleek government offices, seedy nightclubs, markets, and a beautiful water centrepiece make it both varied and pretty. Mass Effect visually is a mixed bag. Character models in particular can look a bit jagged, while certain facial models, ironically mostly human facial models, can often seem a bit lifeless and plastic. However, where it shines brightest in the visual department is in its level design, both in terms of breadth and aesthetics, and the Citadel is the finest of all the worlds you will explore. Thirdly, is the sheer amount of things to see and do. As I mentioned, this is where you acquire your first main missions through exploration, as well as a litany of optional side quests. One of the things I found surprising upon replaying Mass Effect was how few main missions there actually are in the game, totaling at about a dozen. However, as with everything else in the game, the scope of these missions means that many of them can take as long as a few hours to fully complete, making them feel like smaller games within a game, especially considering that they take place on a variety of different planets with entirely different inhabitants and surroundings. Take this mission on the Citadel as a prime example. The goal here is to simply expose Saren. However, in typical Mass Effect fashion, this doesn't have to be just a simple mission where you necessarily go from point A to point B. After Kaidan reminds Shepard of a Turian CSEC officer they overheard who may have information on Saren, Donald Udina, a human ambassador to the Council and a bit of a knob, suggests you locate another CSEC officer named Harkin, who may know his whereabouts. Anderson directs you towards a Volus named Bar Levon, who allegedly works for an information dealer named the Shadow Broker. Voluses are a race which have their own embassy on the Citadel, and although they are physically weak, they are intelligent and are keen tradesmen. Meanwhile, a doctor named Chloe Michelle will inform you of a Quarian named Tali, whom she believes has incriminating evidence against Fist, an agent of the Shadow Broker with ties to Saren, and a known crime figure who owns the Cora's Den nightclub. This is your first taste of the non-linearity of Mass Effect's mission structure and storytelling. While yes, it's true that you will eventually get the information you need and end up departing the Citadel in search of Saren, regardless of how you go about it, how you go about it can have much further reaching impact on the story. First of all, the fact that you can choose to go after multiple different leads showcases a significant structural freedom in and of itself. Secondly, how you interact with people can have somewhat significant consequences with regards to plot. For example, when you do confront Fist, you can de-escalate the situation peacefully, which will result in you getting what you want while also keeping him alive. But you can also use violence, which will ultimately end in Fist losing his life. And although Fist is a minor character, he does appear in later games as a minor character again. However, if you did kill him, this of course would never happen. Of even bigger significance though, are Rex and Garrus. Garrus is the aforementioned CSEC officer who you will eventually track down. Not only does he have information on Saren, but he wants to join Shepard's squad and track him down, something he is willing to leave his CSEC job to pursue. Garrus is one of the best characters in the whole game. Calm, witty, but with a touch of cold cynicism. He is one of the more likeable characters in the entire trilogy. Rex is a badass Krogan. Krogans are a warlike alien race who were almost wiped out by the Genophage, a plague created by the Solarians to limit their ability to reproduce. Rex is indicative of his race, physically imposing, strong, violent, uncompromising and stubborn, but with a frank honesty and a warrior's code. While not quite as good a character as Garrus and some others, he is still a critical part of the squad and the story. The thing, however, is that you can actually refuse to take either man on as a team member. Now, to be fair, the game strongly encourages you to take them aboard the Normandy, and actually gives you a second chance to do so before departing, should you reject either or both of them initially. But for those of us who've played the trilogy, the idea of not having someone like Garrus as a member of your squad is almost unfathomable. Chances are that almost everyone will accept them both, but the fact that the game even gives you this option not to, which again can strip away a whole narrative thread across 3 games, is a testament to the freedom over the story arc afforded to the player. Before departing the Citadel, you are given 2 leads from Anderson and Udina. One is of a Geth sighting on Feros, a human colony. The other is Liara Tassoni, an Asari scientist who specialises in protein technology, and who is doing research somewhere in the Artemis Tau cluster. More importantly, she is the daughter of Matriarch Benezia, one of the main antagonists who has allied herself with Saren. The Asari race is the most human-esque race out of all the aliens in the game. An all-female race, their gentle voices, slim figures and soft blue features were obviously designed to titillate the mostly male gaming demographic. Personally, I don't find blue aliens attractive, but I will say that Liara is the most likeable, prominent and enduring of all of Shepard's allies, and not just in this game, but throughout the entire trilogy. And hey, I mean, if you've got a thing for her, listen, no judgment, whatever you're into, man. You're given the choice whether to go to Feros or find Liara first. For the sake of covering all the squad members as well as some of the other features in the game not yet discussed, let's just assume you went after Liara first. This is the last full mission in the game I'm going to be analysing, and we'll just use it as a way to critique some features. I'll also be exercising brevity for the sake of time, and so I can cover more of the facets of Mass Effect by looking at it more broadly. And I also don't want to spoil any more of the plot than I have to. The first order of business is travelling to Artemis Tau. You do this by accessing the galaxy map in the combat centre of the Normandy. The galaxy map looks a little primitive. It's essentially a 2D map of the Milky Way, with a tiny version of the Normandy acting as a cursor to select areas in the galaxy to travel to. Even still, I found that I got used to it quite quickly and actually find it quite charming now, with its quaint design and relaxing ambient music that comes on every time you access it. Using the map, you can opt to travel to Artemis Tau, one of the many accessible clusters scattered throughout the Milky Way. After a mass relay blasting cutscene is triggered, you're brought to a sub-map which shows a small collection of systems dotted around the cluster. You can travel to any of these systems, which bring up yet another sub-menu showing planets orbiting a star. All of the game's clusters and systems work the same interactively. Some are bigger than others, some contain more systems and more planets than others, but each one can be interacted with. Granted, a majority of the planets can only be observed, and to be fair, there are a number of planets within our own solar system which are completely unhospitable to humans, such as gas giants and planets with severe levels of gravity, so we can give the game a pass on this. Even still, there are a number of planets that can be physically explored, and to the game's credit, most of them have no links to the main story, and are often there to accommodate side missions and collectible extras, more, of course, on which later. After finding the correct planet, you're launched from the Normandy to its surface in the Mako, a 6-wheel tank that you can use to land on any planet without a boarding dock. Now, controlling the Mako isn't quite as intuitive as you might like, as the non-fixed third-person camera can make steering in the intended direction a little awkward at times. The Mako can jump hydraulically to avoid enemy attacks, which is a nice touch, but it does feel a little tacked on, like the developers needed to implement something to avoid the vehicle simply becoming a bullet sponge, and allowing it to jump was the best or easiest option. The Mako can also fire on enemies. It has 2 guns, a railgun which sprays automatic fire and deals moderate damage, and a cannon which can only be fired every few seconds, but hits with much more force. As you make your way through the level, which is a volcanic mountainous terrain, you begin to see the contrast between level designs. This and the Citadel could not look more different, and although the game is far from a visual powerhouse, it is graphically pleasing enough to be more than tolerable. You drive through the winding roads trying not to fall into piping hot magma, picking off enemy targets one by one as you make your way. Eventually you'll come to a section of the road cut off by fallen rock debris, allowing you just enough space to squeeze by on foot, conveniently enough. Here is where you engage in your first really heavy combat. It's in this level that the game introduces 2 new enemies also, the Geth armatures, which are massive quadrupedal Geth that fire powerful laser pulses at you, and the Ghost Geth, which are much smaller and shoot less powerful lasers, but can stick to walls and fly around incredibly fast. This is the first fight that really tests you. You'll face a variety of enemies from foot soldiers to snipers to the 2 aforementioned advanced Geth. During the fight, there's a high probability that you will switch multiple times between weapons and will, should one of your squad mates possess the ability, be ordering them to use frequent biotic attacks. There is also a strong likelihood that your squad will die and need to be revived, assuming you don't perish with them. This level really emphasises the importance of weapon selection, biotic attacks, and upgrades. Like every good RPG, it challenges you in order to incentivize you to gain experience and upgrade your attacks, bolster your defences, and hone your skills. However, unlike in other RPGs, there really is no grinding in Mass Effect. Almost every situation you're in which leads to fighting or scavenging occurs during a story or as part of a side mission. You make your way to the dig site where, after disposing of some more Geth soldiers, you find Liara trapped behind a Prothean force field, which she used to keep the Geth away from her. Here, you can sympathise with her plight and release her, ridicule her stupidity before releasing her, or grill her on the association with her mother, a woman whom she denounces. However, this is an optional conversational strand, which is skippable. After releasing her via a mining laser, which triggers the slow collapse of the mine, you again fight your way out, hook up with Joker, the pilot of the Normandy, and now you have your entire squad. Again, out of all the squad, Liara is my personal favourite. Although lacking the humour of a Garrus or the gumption of a Rex, she has a serene quality and intelligence that makes her very likeable. And as I mentioned, she is one of the signature characters in the entire series, so should you play the other 2 games in the trilogy, which you absolutely should, then you'll grow quite attached to her. After completing this mission, again assuming for the sake of convenience that you didn't go to Pharaoh's first, it is at this point that the game can really open up and breathe. Scavenging and levelling up aside, Mass Effect had been relatively linear up until this point. Now you have the freedom to literally explore the entire galaxy. As I mentioned, there are only about a dozen main missions in the game, and even though most of them are quite lengthy, and many of them span multiple sections or planets, simply following the main quests would see you complete the game relatively quickly. Fortunately, through a combination of incentivized character upgrading and a litany of side missions, you are very unlikely to simply follow the main game. So what are the side missions like? Well, first of all, there are a ton of them. There are 70 side quests, or assignments as they're called in the game, if you include the downloadable content. Naturally, these range from great to merely enjoyable to tedious game completion. But for now, let's focus on the great. At their best, the assignments are somewhat lengthy, multi-faceted quests with intriguing stories, engaging gameplay, and multiple outcomes which affect your morality meter, as well as potentially affecting the rest of the game, and potentially even the series. An example of this is an assignment called Jaleed's Fears. Jaleed, a Vola scientist, tells Shepard that his business partner, a Solarian named Corbin, wants him dead. Now you may have already come across Corbin at the beginning of the game, where he asks you to engage in one of the most commonly known side quests, scanning the mysterious Citadel Keepers, who are strange giant grasshoppers diligently working on computers, and gathering data on them for him. Anyway, this one assignment has a few twists and turns in it, including double-crossing and treachery, and can end with one of the characters dying, one of the characters being extorted or arrested, and can even end the original Keeper scanning side quest prematurely. While this particular quest has no long-term franchise consequences, other less elaborate ones, such as Shepard's fan, actually do. The fact that the team devoted that much variety and dialogue to one side mission is commendable, and one of the things that makes Mass Effect so special. The theme of morality and far-reaching consequences is truly one of the hallmarks of this game. It's difficult to comprehend if you've never played the trilogy, but so many of your actions have lasting consequences that can literally change the course of the entire story, right down to the ending of Mass Effect 3. Most of these occur during the dialogue sections, where Shepard's words or choices in one moment can alter the lore of the series permanently. To exemplify this, there is literally a moment in the game where Shepard has the power to exterminate an entire alien race. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, the narrative foresight on display here is nothing short of astonishing. Multiple endings in video games is nothing new, exhibited in titles as old as 1995's Chrono Trigger. But for this to occur across 3 separate games is pretty incredible. The morality system is not only affected by the decisions you make, but can actively affect your decision-making ability. The charm and intimidate abilities that Shepard possesses and uses, depending on whether you're a Paragon or a Renegade, open up alternative dialogue options which, when chosen, can affect the outcome of key situations. A prime example of this occurs later in the game, during a standoff between Shepard and a member of his squad. If you haven't sufficiently upgraded those stats, then Shepard is unable to de-escalate the situation, or intimidate the person in question, which ends in that squad member getting killed. The result of which means that the person in question either appears in later games or does not, which is one of many smaller ripples in the story that can be altered. It's also another incentive to keep your characters upgraded. Speaking of dialogue, the sheer amount of dialogue in this game is ridiculous. I would love to actually find out metrically how much dialogue was used in this game, as I'm sure it will be staggering. Firstly, you have to take into account the sheer amount of characters that Shepard can interact with. Then you have to consider how your different actions affect different situations, and hence result in alternative dialogue. Then, and this is the part that really gets me, you have to consider the different squad combinations. When you're not on the Normandy, you can only have 2 squad members with you at one time. During missions and interactions, your squad will chime in with opinions and information pertaining to, say, the mission at hand or like the planet that you're on. The dialogue, as well as the sentiments, change from person to person. If you're on a mission with, for example, Liara and Ashley, and you come across a situation or a person and you're faced with a morality choice, Their advice to Shepard will be completely different than that given had he chosen to take out Garrus and Tali, for example. It may seem like a small detail, but when you consider the amount of situations where the squad chimes in, and when you consider the different potential combinations of members, it's actually pretty incredible. I also want to take this time to talk about Shepard's relationship with his squad members. This actually wasn't part of the script. It's something that I decided to go back and talk about afterwards because it's such a key detail. Shepard builds up relationships with his squad mates. You can have conversations with them, you can learn more about them. And again, this comes back to the morality. If he responds in a certain way to a piece of information given by his squad mates, or he responds in a certain way to them confiding in him about something personal, that will affect how close they will become, how they will interact with each other, etc., etc. And as I alluded to with Liara, Shepard can also engage romantically with different squad members, again based on previous conversations and things like that. There's probably a bunch of other things that I'm leaving out of the video. As I said, the game is just so deep and so extensive, and there's just so much going on that I'm probably forgetting to mention a dozen different things. But I felt compelled to go back and talk about this because it's so critical. So with all that said, what are some of the issues that plague Mass Effect? I've made a lot of excuses for some of the game's shortcomings, simply because, in my opinion, the sheer amount of things the game does exonerates some of its flaws. That being said, there are a few faults that are too glaring to simply ignore. To start with, let's look at Shepard his or herself. Mass Effect, like many open world games, has a tendency not to stand up well under close visual scrutiny. The aesthetics of the game, from the menu presentation to planetary environments, look really good, and oftentimes even great. However, there are some graphical elements that aren't quite as pleasing to the eye. Chief among them are some of the character models, and more specifically the human models, and more specifically again, Commander Shepard. Considering how much effort was put into the game in general, it baffles me that they couldn't have made Shepard more expressive. Aside from having one of the blandest faces possible, a truth for both genders, but particularly for the male Shepard, his face barely changes from situation to situation. Whether he's pointing a gun at someone, threatening to detach their head from their body, or making the moves on one of his squad mates, a furrowed brow or an awkward smirk is all we have to go on to distinguish lust from bloodlust. By the same token, the voice acting can also be pretty poor. Again, as I mentioned, there is so much dialogue in this game that it's totally forgivable not to get a 5-star performance from like a one-off character on a desolate planet. But the fact that Shepard's acting is stiffer than his or her character model's face is kind of unforgivable. Again, like with the facial animations, I just cannot understand why they didn't insist on a stronger performance from the voice actors, or, in a worst case scenario, had hired better ones. What's baffling is that so many of the other secondary characters benefited from solid voiceover work. To be fair, none of them were ever going to win any awards, but at least characters like Joker, Garrus and Saren have some personality. Many of the side missions can also become quite repetitive. The worst offenders are the Galaxy Collection assignments. Basically, there are 5 sites, artifacts or minerals that are scattered across different planets in all of the clusters. To access or collect them, you have to hack them like you would a storage locker, which makes no logistical sense whatsoever. The problem is that this becomes extremely tedious, not just because you have to engage in the same button matching minigame over and over, but also because these artifacts are oftentimes in hard to reach places, or at the opposite end of the map from where they normally drop the Mako. To the game's credit, you don't have to collect every single one of these to complete the assignment, and some of them can even impact the outcomes of certain situations in later games. But still, it can become a grind after a while. Also, some of the combat assignments also suffer from repetitiveness. I actually grew to learn the level design of the generic bunkers of the enemies you have to clean out on different planets by heart, because it was copied and pasted so much. There are also minor gameplay issues that I've already alluded to. Mass Effect is perhaps the most jack-of-all-trades video game I've ever played, so therefore it was never going to nail every gameplay mechanic perfectly. Even still, some of the bugs and technical issues can become annoying after a while. For example, the friendly enemy AI can be pretty woeful. The ability to order your squad is supposed to add another tactical layer to the experience. However, it rarely works as intended. Telling your squad to take positions at different areas in the map is basically a death sentence if you're under heavy fire, as they will run aimlessly through bullets. Conversely, if you just keep them at your 6, they'll rarely if ever display any intelligence when it comes to self-defense. You also always have to order them to utilize defensive attributes like shields and health, and you have to order biotics to use their attacks. I understand the appeal of the game allowing you complete autonomy over how to engage the enemy, but this is not a turn-based RPG. It's a live-action third-person shooter. So considering there are 3 of you often facing multiple enemies, it would have been nice if the squad AI took an executive decision to use these powers for themselves every now and again. I don't understand why the developers couldn't have had their cake and eaten it too. I mean, give the AI personal agency to defend and attack using something other than a gun, while allowing you to give these specific orders in specific situations. The combat can also be glitchy at times, with grenades hanging aimlessly in mid-air and enemies often acting erratically. As for leveling up and upgrading, I pretty much don't have a problem with either. Sure, they're deep as hell, but this is meant to be an immersive action RPG at the end of the day, so it's better to have too much depth than none. Even still, there is one aspect of it that kind of irritates me, and that is the sheer amount of weaponry, ammunition, and armour you can obtain. That seems like a small thing, and in a way it is, but if you're not constantly on top of your inventory, selling unwanted items or reducing them to Omnigel, the game's currency, it can easily get on top of you. You can only carry 300 weaponry items at a time, which seems like a lot, but when you consider the fact that you have a squad of 7 people with armour and multiple weapons, all of which carry different ammo types and multiple enhancements, you actually gather items pretty quickly. Again, the problem is not the amount of variety, it's the overwhelming volume of certain items. For example, I can remember having over a dozen Lancer assault rifles in my inventory. Now, considering the fact that there are multiple assault rifle types in the game, and that only 3 members of my squad can even wield them with any skill, it just doesn't make sense that the game would allow me to pick up so many of them, even for the purpose of selling. Also, these weapons are staggered in a numerical hierarchy system, going from 1 to 9, so it's possible to have a Lancer 1 in your inventory, as well as a Lancer 9, or 5, or 7, etc. This is even more stressful when it comes to weapon upgrades and ammo. I cannot even remember how many cryogenic rounds I had for each weapon type, which again ranged from Cryo 1 to Cryo 9. But my biggest issue with Mass Effect by far, and the one thing that annoys me more than anything, is the autosave. Mass Effect is one of the most immersive and enjoyable games I've ever played. But nothing takes me out of said immersion more than after watching an important cutscene. A cutscene which may determine the fate of a character or, say, the arc of a story, then cutting back to a live action screen, frozen with a rotating disc, with the word saving written underneath it. This is the one thing in the game that I cannot forgive. It baffles me that they couldn't have found a way around this. If they had just kept the screen black after a cutscene for a few seconds, keeping the music playing, that actually would have been better. At least then it wouldn't completely take you out of the experience. Again, Mass Effect is like any other open world action RPG. It's going to be buggy and imperfect simply because it's trying to accomplish so much at once. But there is no reason logistically that the developers couldn't have figured out a better way to load or save the data mid-game. So, with the groundwork laid out and the negativity out of the way, how does the rest of the game play out? Well, in terms of the main story, it plays out across 4 planets: Pharos, Noveria, Vermeer, and Ilos. Pharos is a desolate human colony under attack by Geth. Undermanned and poverty-stricken, its bland colour palette and crumbling infrastructure conveys this feeling very well. And while you're there on official Citadel business, you find yourself embroiled in the armed struggle fighting against the Geth. Architecturally, its network of underground passages littered with Geth and madmen make for a claustrophobic shooting gallery, while the overground runway makes what is perhaps the best and most logical use of the Mako in the entire game. Noveria is a small frozen terrestrial planet outside of Citadel space, which is the base of operations for the Noveria Development Corporation, a controversial tech company who engage in radical scientific experimentation away from the prying eyes of the Citadel. The Noveria section is one of my personal favourites in the entire game because of the variety and its pacing. After docking, you make your way inside what is actually a very posh looking main area, with an open concept lobby, bougie nightclubs, nice looking offices, and heavily armed security. It's aesthetically very pleasing and has a really appealing layout, and contrasts beautifully with Pharos, a planet you may have visited just prior to docking on Noveria. You're there to find someone, and your initial goal is simply to gain access to the underground garage. What I love about this is how much red tape bureaucracy you have to navigate simply to get as far as the garage. This involves infiltrating a lab, dealing with double agents, exposing a giant smuggling operation, among many other things. After this lengthy expedition, you finally have access to the garage, which brings you to the next section of the game, which is far more heavy on action and sci-fi, again demonstrating the game's narrative and gameplay variety. By the time you get to Vermeer and Ilos, you will be deep into the game's second half, with the story really picking up traction. Vermeer is a lush, Earth-like planet with massive water coverage, animal and plant life. It is perhaps the most action-packed mission in the entire game, and sees Shepard and his crew fighting alongside a Solarian army to combat a massive Geth onslaught in what turns into a lengthy and tense battle. Ilos, on the other hand, is an ancient Prothean planet, filled with archaic structures and monuments and surrounded by overgrowing flora. It resembles an Aztec ruin aesthetically and staggered vertically structurally. It's here that many of the key plot points are revealed and resolved, and leads directly into Mass Effect's final act. There are three things I loved about these missions, aside from the general mechanics which I've already discussed. The first are the contrasting worlds. Pharos, Noveria, Vermeer and Ilos are such different worlds. The buildings and surroundings are totally at odds, and even the inhabitants are unique and have very different motivations. Secondly, the length. Whether you're playing through them for the first time or you're simply taking the time to fully explore these levels, each of these missions should take you at least a few hours to complete. In fact, some of them by themselves, particularly Noveria, are probably longer than your average Call of Duty campaign. This is what I mean when I say that these missions are almost like a game within a game. They have their own story arc, their own characters, and present their own problems and decisions. And that brings me to the third thing, story and resolution. As you make your way through these quests, you begin to form Shepard into the character you want him or her to be. You build up Renegade or Paragon points, you interact with people in a certain way, you take actions which can have either positive or negative outcomes. These not only affect the story, but how your squad perceives you, and how these planets' inhabitants, all of which again are unique and have their own charm, treat you. Also, each of these missions either has a boss battle or a significant event which act as a punctuation point to conclude the mission. These can have massive long-term consequences for the remainder of the trilogy at large, and you're often presented with ultimatums that will have sizable impacts regardless of what decision you make. When you combine everything I've just mentioned with the gameplay mechanics and presentation of the game, it's not hard to see why Mass Effect is such a special experience. Mass Effect somehow manages to be both simultaneously bigger than the sum of its parts, while also being defined and elevated by those components. I said at the very beginning that Mass Effect is like a gaming smorgasbord, and I think that's as apt an analogy as any, pardon the arrogance. Mass Effect is such an ambitious title that the fact that it manages to pull off the vast majority of what it sets out to do successfully is an incredible feat in and of itself. It's hard to describe it if you've never played it, but once you're deep into the game, it really all just comes together beautifully. Mass Effect is not necessarily a cohesive experience, and in most other games, this would be a detriment. But not here. In Mass Effect, part of the joy is in juggling all these different components. The tricky combat, inventory management, keeping your squad upgraded, trying to understand its massive fictitious intergalactic lore, while also trying to shape the story and its protagonist in your desired image. Mass Effect is not perfect, no, but it is truly a special experience. Its scope and ambition as a game and as a series is unparalleled, and it succeeds far more often than it has any right to. What you are left with is an undeniably classic game, and the foundation of perhaps the greatest trilogy in gaming history.